Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, during the Budget 2021 and subsequent Committee of Supply debates, I had suggested that our notion of infrastructure should not be limited to traditional understandings of physical structures and facilities. I explained how, if we wish to be a leader in the modern, knowledge-driven economy of the future, we can and should direct our development expenditures ever more toward investments that are essentially weightless in nature, and scale back on the lumbering, massive capital projects of yesteryear. Today, I wish to flesh out these arguments in greater detail. I will explain how investments in human capital are not only distinct from investments in labor, but also more akin to our usual definitions of infrastructure. I will also share how returns to human capital often significantly exceed those of hard infrastructure, even as we are looking purely at the boost to macroeconomic growth. I then offer a simple checklist of how we can distinguish between human capital investments from recurrent expenditures. For starters, allow me again to applaud the Ministry for its willingness to relax its traditional reticence toward borrowing, to recognize that this really is an opportune time to exploit historically low interest rates to finance important, long-term investment opportunities. I sincerely believe that there is a pearl of wisdom in this oyster of insight. I do have a number of concerns specific to the bill itself. My first concern has to do with both the total borrowing limits of 90 billion as well as the interest threshold amount of 5.5 billion stated in Clause 5 of the Act. While I understand that it is ultimately necessary to impose specific thresholds, I think it's worth asking how these values were arrived at. I also wonder why the interest threshold of 5 billion was chosen, which would imply an interest rate of 5.6%, as Minister Heng alluded to, because this strikes me as rather high given the current interest rate environment. And since rates are locked in at the time of issuance, it also raises the hurdle rate for infrastructure investments that may be considered. Second, I note that Clause 5 of the Act also allows for monies to be raised in foreign currency. As Member Fumiha has mentioned, this suggests that if our inherent liabilities are long-term and denominated in Singapore dollars, this exposure, if undertaken in foreign currency, subjects the debt to a non-trivial amount of currency risk. What mitigation mechanisms does the Ministry or MAS plan to deploy to limit such risks? Third, Clause 11.2 of the Act defines nationally significant infrastructure to be one that has a useful life of at least 50 years upon completion of the project. Again, while I appreciate that a duration for what constitutes significant would ultimately have to be chosen, I would note that many existing infrastructure projects would not have qualified under this rather long time span. The Tanjong Pagar Container Terminal, for instance, began operations in 1972 and moved to Pasir Panjang in 2017, amounting to 46 years. The Brani Terminal dates back to 1992 and is set to be decommissioned in 2027, by which it will have operated for 36 years. Kallang Airport lasted for 19 years, and Paya Lebar Air Base, while it operated as Singapore International Airport, lasted 28. A lower useful life threshold of, say, 35 years strikes me as more reasonable. Finally, I would add that Clause 11.4 requires that the qualifying capital expenditure for every project participant must amount to at least 4 billion. For public-private partnership projects, then, this would either rule out those where the government is either unable to secure sufficient private sector buy-in, which may in and of itself be a signal of the project's potential viability, or when buy-in is sufficiently large, it would preclude the government from being able to take a minority stake. I understand that this is the purpose, but nevertheless, it should be clear what our trade-offs are. Now, having said all that, what is infrastructure? The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the basic systems and facilities needed for the operation of a society or enterprise. Such systems and facilities could, and typically do, refer to roads, bridges, power, ports, or what I will refer to as hard infrastructure. Roads get us to work, power keeps us working, and ports allow us to sell the fruits of our work to markets far and wide. There's no dispute that when designed and implemented well, hard infrastructure, accumulated over the span of many years or decades, can yield valuable payoffs to an economy and society, and hence is an endeavor worthy of government investment. But it is not difficult to conceive of other systems that are critical for the successful functioning of any modern economy. We sit in a house operating under the auspices of a particularly successful realization of the Westminster system of government, without which our contracts might not be honored, our policies not delivered, or our peace not guaranteed. Our healthcare system has kept us safe from the ravages of COVID-19, and our educational system has allowed our emergence, in the words of founding father Lee Kuan Yew, from third world to first. These latter two aspects, health and education, unarguably constitute systems that enable the operation of not just our, but any 21st century economy. We often refer to the accumulation of knowledge and wellness which makes us productive as human capital, and the systems that deliver human capital are essentially soft infrastructure. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am not alone in insisting that infrastructure can be more broadly and meaningfully defined. The recently announced American Jobs Plan, while billed as a $2 trillion infrastructure stimulus, nevertheless construes a much wider scope for what constitutes infrastructure, including the sort of soft infrastructure components I am suggesting here. Now, if one is willing to apply a charitable interpretation, Clause 2 of the bill actually already allows for SINGA to encompass soft infrastructure. Part B7 states that investments are to support or materially improve productivity, and Part C requires that they benefit present and future generations of Singaporeans. Human capital investments are entirely consistent with both of these subclauses. The only limitation being that it constrains infrastructure to any structure or building, whereas I would instead allow for structure, building, or project instead. Now, the standard concern that this government has historically raised is that we should not be financing routine spending, the payment of our education and healthcare professionals, or funding allocated to subsidize such efforts with long-term borrowing. But these are only recurrent expenditures when viewed from the perspective of the service delivery providers. In this sense, paying our teachers and our trainers, our doctors and nurses, our scientists and researchers are certainly a variable cost. But when viewed from the perspective of the recipients, our students, our temporarily sick, our potential inventors, we can see how we are ultimately vesting value into the future. Moreover, we already systematically embed development expenditures, which by definition are deigned to be long-lasting, into our annual fiscal budgets, a recognition that is of what is spent on a year-to-year basis cannot be easily disentangled from multi-year projects. By the same token, funds devoted to soft infrastructure can and should be regarded as non-recurrent development financing, especially when returns are expected to accrue over the very long run. My Sengkang colleague, Louis Chua, will elaborate on why this distinction between development expenditures and long-term assets may well turn out to be an artificial construct. Another objection to government investment in human capital, or soft infrastructure more generally, is that being embedded in private individuals, investing the greatest benefits to them directly, could mean that it's difficult to justify paying for skill and experience acquisition out of the public purse. However, there are means by which such private returns may be recovered. One approach is to offer scholarships that are contingent on incomes finally earned. I will return to this example in a bit. When we think about investments, the standard approach is to compare observed returns. This is bread and butter work for the professionals, fund management industry, of which I've been a part. As an asset class, the expected long-term returns from global infrastructure, net of inflation, is only 2.6%. In contrast, the real returns to an additional year of schooling is often in the order of 10.2%, almost 10 times as large. One could argue, of course, that such returns are private returns and do not capture the contributions of each of these factors in macroeconomic performance. That's fair enough. So let's go ahead and compare their respective contributions to economic growth. While estimates may differ, one recent study suggests that a 1% increase in infrastructure capital can elevate output by 7 to 10%. Not a number to be sniffed at, but the comparable increase in secondary education alone could induce gains of 10 to 12%. Other credible estimates suggest even higher gains, as much as 16%. So the bottom line is straightforward. Whether we focus on public or private returns, investments in soft infrastructure, such as human capital, generally offer a higher payoff compared to hard infrastructure. And my belief is that we should invest more in the type of infrastructure assets that offer a greater bang for the buck. Now, while a comprehensive checklist for evaluating the merits of any human capital project falls well beyond the scope of this speech, I will sketch out some assessment criteria that I believe are worth considering as to whether a project should be classified as soft infrastructure. First, as a basic principle, the assessed returns from the project should more than pay for its original outlays. This is a remarkably low hurdle. Schooling projects that permanently raise an individual's income, say a full ride scholarship to university, could translate into as much as 70% higher lifetime earnings. Such higher incomes would mean higher tax returns over the course of the person's working life, which could easily pay for the original costs of the scholarship. Most capital projects often impose static criteria involving cash flow analysis. The most common among these are payback period computations, which is the time needed for the project to return the original investment in terms of cash flows generated. For hard infrastructure, these may be measured in terms of tolls or user fees. For soft infrastructure, these would be evaluated by enhanced tax revenue. Since changes in taxable incomes are not generally large, we can conceivably entertain payback periods of between 10 and 12 years. Third, capital projects also allow for dynamic criteria, such as the net present value of a project or its internal rate of return. Such criteria are easily adjusted to accommodate human capital projects. The main adaptation is to substitute the useful working life of a project with the average duration of a working life. In advanced economies, this duration averages 36 years. This itself would exceed the useful life threshold of 35 years that I outlined earlier for hard infrastructure projects. Finally, as is the case for hard infrastructure, all borrowing should roll in the full amount of the project's expenditure, including interest costs, and regardless of whether the disbursement is over time, into the initial borrowing issuance. This protects against unexpected changes in interest rates and the need to roll over borrowing. Now, what might some examples of soft infrastructure projects, which broadly meet the conditions I set out above, be? In my earlier speeches, I spoke about how we could finance smaller class sizes, even if on a limited basis for languages and math, or to provide additional funding for teaching aids. This will allow us to avoid closing or merging schools and instead direct SINGA funds toward keeping schools open, albeit with trimmed down class sizes. Similarly, we could use SINGA to seed an initial insurance risk pool so as to enable us to roll out redundancy insurance without delay and without drawing down on our reserves. The Workers' Party manifesto has also suggested raising the targeted percentage of university graduates per cohort, expanding additional baseline funding for less popular schools, and expanding the number of infant care centers, especially in demographically consistent neighborhoods. All these examples could conceivably qualify as long-term human capital accumulation projects. Two more ideas may be considered. First, we could use Singer to seed a fund for income contingent scholarships, as I mentioned earlier. The government pays for all the costs of university or a continuing education program, perhaps subject to a very modest co-payment as collateral. The recipient would then pay off the acquired debt only in the event that they secure a job following graduation. Of course, some details, such as the specific major that is allowed to be undertaken, may need to be finessed. But the overall idea strikes me as eminently implementable. Second, we could direct Singer funds toward vouchers that would be applied by parents to send their children to both non-KIFAS eligible preschools as well as charter schools, which are schools allowed to develop non-traditional syllabi that de-emphasize academic testing, but nevertheless set rigorous, accessible markers for inquiry, innovation, imagination, and invention. The key difference here is that these schools would be funded indirectly by the vouchers instead of direct Ministry of Education approved funding. The upshot of such schools is that they may even generate excellent test scores, even if this objective does not feature in their original mandates. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have thus far emphasized all the economic payoffs to investing in soft infrastructure. In closing, allow me to also touch on why the benefits of human capital accumulation go far beyond simply improving the productive capacity of our economy. A nation rich in human capital is often one that is simultaneously rich in ideas and experiences, happiness and well-being, wisdom and understanding. These contribute far beyond the narrow scope of economics. An educated and informed populace will be engaged, creative participants in our political process, enhancing our democratic credibility. Creative and curious individuals also bring out diversity and novelty to our social environment, enriching our cultural and artistic landscape. Indeed, Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who pioneered much of the early work on human capital, deeply understood the importance of habits, culture, and social interactions, and the role they played in the long-run success of a nation. It is in this spirit, extending beyond only dollars and cents, that I'm making the case for us to expand our conceptualization of Singer infrastructure beyond structures and buildings to encompass investment in our children, in our people, in the one resource that we truly have as a country. On that note, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I offer my support for the bill.
Order. I propose to take a break now. I suspend the sitting and will take the chair at 5:15 p.m. Order, order.